and I am the Title IX coordinator at Pacific. And I was asked to talk with you a little bit about discrimination and harassment in the workplace. And so I thought I would talk with you and have a conversation with you. And so I do encourage you that if you have questions or comments, to please feel free to make them or to identify that you have a question, and I'd be happy to answer them. Most of you may recall some of the Title IX training that you did at Pacific at some point in time. Some of you may have even spoken with me about discrimination and harassment issues related to sex or gender during your time at Pacific. And today we're going to take just a slightly different path, right, and talk about discrimination and harassment in the workplace outside of Pacific, or outside, let's say, of a university setting. There are some distinctions between how employers, if you will, outside of the university handle discrimination and harassment that slightly differ from how the university would handle issues of discrimination and harassment. And so I thought I would lay some of that out in a conversational way with you. And then, like I said, I can answer any questions or talk with you about how some things might be handled. So in a university setting, just to set some ground rules, in a university setting, right, for students, Title IX applies. Okay, Title IX is the law that basically says no one, right, based on their gender should be discriminated against. Okay. And we use sex and gender interchangeably in terms of Title IX. Employees at Pacific University are also covered by Title IX, but employees at Pacific University are also covered by something that's called Title VII. And Title VII applies to the workplace, regardless of whether it's a university or a company or organization. Title IX only applies to educational institutions. So if you're going to go out into the world and you're going to work at a place that is not a university, then Title VII is what will apply and not Title IX. So Title VII basically says that you cannot be harassed or discriminated against based on your race, your color, your sex, or your national origin. Okay, so the difference between Title VII and Title IX is location, so a university versus another company, but also how the discrimination or harassment is handled by the employer, because there are some differences. So in Title IX, you might recall, there's a great deference, if you will, to what the complainant, the person bringing forward the complaint, wants to do about the complaint. There's a great deal of deference. So if the complainant would like an investigation, then we would conduct an investigation. If a complainant does not want an investigation, chances are we would not conduct an investigation. If the complainant wants to handle it in some alternative way, we would respect that and we would try to find that path. Title VII is a little different. So in the workplace, the employer has the obligation to respond to any act of harassment or discrimination based on race or sex or color or national origin. As a result, although they may want to take the complainant's wishes into account, they do not have to, but they do have to respond. And so sometimes that creates a bit of concern on the part of an employee. So as you know, some people are uncomfortable coming to the Title IX office to make a report because they're afraid of what might happen. Well, if you're an employee at a company, that same kind of fear, like what's going to happen, kicks in, right? Especially because if you're an employee at a company, you may not have as much choice. Your wishes may not be taken into account as much or to the same degree, because the company does not have to do that, but the company has to respond in some way. So those are some differences between how Title VII is handled and how Title IX is handled in an employment environment. There are also differences in process and procedure. So, for example, in Title IX, what you might be used to in terms of Title IX is if you were to call the Title IX office, we would lay out for you all kinds of different potential ways to resolve a situation. Some that involve an investigation, some that might involve a conversation, some that might involve education of some sort or training, or even something different than that, or some combination of all of those. The process would be transparent. You would know what's happening each step of the way. You would be told, I would tell you, this is what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to tell you what I've done. All right. Title VII, not so much, right? The employer could do that if they wanted to, but they have no obligation to do that. So if you were to make a report to your employer that you were feeling harassed or discriminated against, your employer then would be the one to decide, okay, you know what, Sherry, this is how we're going to handle your case. This is what we're going to do. I might like that. I might not like that. I might be concerned because the person will know who I am. Sometimes they don't always have to know who I am. They can be a little bit more anonymous in the employment context than we can be in Title IX. But I would have much less control, or I would feel as though I would have much less control. Not a reason not to file the complaint, but it feels just a little different than if you're filing a Title IX complaint. Title VII complaints, so those complaints of harassment and discrimination in the workplace, usually result in some sort of an investigation, almost always. Almost always. An investigation gets kicked off. The investigation, though, looks very different than a Title IX investigation. So in a Title IX investigation, for example, you would know everything that's happening. You would get a letter up front and it would say, this is what's been alleged. Here is the process for how we're going to resolve that. You would have rights in that process. You would have the right to meet with the investigator. You would have the right to provide materials. You would have the right to ask questions of the investigator and of the other party or witnesses. You would have the right to produce evidence. You would have the right to review all of the evidence the investigator gathers before the investigator writes their report. In a Title VII situation, a company could provide those things to you, but is under no obligation to do so, and oftentimes does not. So oftentimes an investigation that happens in an employment context gives you far fewer rights. So they might say, yes, Sherry, we're going to conduct an investigation into that. We're really sorry that happened, and we're going to conduct an investigation. And we might let you know the outcome. We don't have to, but we might. Most companies, I would say, trying to provide some more information to the person who's bringing forward the complaint. But in most cases, companies are extremely protective of the privacy of their employees. And so as a result, they are reluctant to share information in an investigation, and certainly even more reluctant to share any kind of discipline or consequence that may have been meted out to the individual found responsible for violating that company's policy. So those differences between Title VII and Title IX are ones that you might encounter if you ever went through a Title VII process, Title IX process at the university, or had knowledge of one, versus if you were to go through a Title VII process at a company. All of that said, that's absolutely no reason not, right, to bring forward your complaints or your concerns. to the employer when you have them. The thing that is the same, regardless of whether you're a student at a university or you're an employee at a company, is that you have the right to be treated with respect. You have the right to not be harassed in your workplace. You have the right to not be discriminated against. You have the right to not work in a hostile environment because of who you are. So those are the same. And as a result, I really encourage you that should you find yourself within a situation within your company or workplace where you are feeling harassed or discriminated against because of your race or your gender or your national origin or your color, that you let that company know that that is going on so that the company can correct for that. And you don't have to suffer that harassment or discrimination anymore. Typically, the places that you would go to make a report of harassment or discrimination is your HR office. Okay, human resources is typically the office that is charged at a company with ensuring that harassment and discrimination is not occurring within the workplace. Supervisors have a particularly important role as they are often held accountable by the company to ensure that harassment and discrimination is not occurring within their unit or within their department or within their office. And so employers are very keen, if you will, to be able to root out harassment and discrimination when they find it, because it is their obligation. Okay, they do have to meet that obligation. And so that's why a lot of times if there's a complaint that's made, you'll often see HR, boom, kick into action and immediately initiate some sort of response or some sort of action. Sometimes that action can be an immediate investigation that's opened up right there and then. Sometimes it can look like placing somebody on what they refer to as investigatory leave or administrative leave, which, depending on the company, usually involves some sort of paid leave for the employee while the investigation is going on. This is something that's also very different than what you might encounter in the Title IX space. So employers have that obligation to ensure that harassment and discrimination is not going on, and they take that obligation very seriously, which is why they tend to not hesitate. Okay, and they tend to actually begin to move forward very, very quickly, which oftentimes can feel very sudden to an employee, unlike that Title IX space. So the harassment and discrimination, the reason it's important that you understand your rights when you go to the workplace is because workplaces are a microcosm, right, of our society, just like universities are. You know, it's understood but sad at the same time, and certainly not something that we want to accept as the norm. That harassment and discrimination does take place in all corners of our society. And our work environment is just one place where that can occur. And so understanding the fact that you have the right to say something, to come forward and to file a complaint, and to expect that your employer will do something in response to correct for it. Not just to say, yeah, you know, I responded, but to actually correct for it, I think is important. There's different harassment discrimination in workplaces comes up in many different kinds of ways. And so I kind of want to talk to you just a little bit about how you might see that, how it might get expressed, so that you have some sense of knowing that something is happening to you. Right? So in the workplace, power differentials are even more well-defined than you'll find in a university environment. So in a workplace, people typically have very specific positions, very specific position titles. There is a hierarchy of employees and supervisors and senior leadership often, or executive kinds of leadership. And there is a much more top-down, if you will, style in many workplaces. Not all of them. Some of them are very flat organizations. But you'll find a much more robust infrastructure when it comes to that kind of hierarchy or positioning of individuals within an organization than you would find within a university. And I think it's important to just be aware of that because that power differential will come into play more often than not in most workplaces. You'll feel it, you'll sense it, it will be part of your day-to-day life, but that doesn't mean it is bad. It just means that's how the organization is organized and has chosen to organize itself. So just because there is a hierarchy and just because there are power differentials related to that hierarchy in and of itself is not a bad thing or is not a negative thing. But it is important to understand how your organization works, how you fit in, where you fit in that structure, so that if something does go wrong, you know where you can find your allies, you know how to elevate something up the chain, and frankly, you know where the HR office is, which is what I would encourage you to learn on your very first day. So knowing that the hierarchy exists, knowing that those power differentials exist, is also something that's important, I think, to keep in mind just when thinking about harassment and discrimination and what constitutes harassment and what constitutes discrimination. So, for example, just because a supervisor asks you to do something, even if they ask you to do something that is maybe slightly outside your job description, does not necessarily mean that you are being harassed or you're being discriminated against because they're asking you to do something outside of your job description. So they can ask you to do certain things. They can ask you to do certain things within your position description. Most position descriptions come with a lovely line that is added on to almost everyone that says other duties as assigned. Okay, and some employers take that very seriously, other duties as assigned. So it is not uncommon that a supervisor might ask you to do something that you think is, maybe pushing the boundaries of your job description. That said, if an employer asks you to do something outside of your job description that is related, for example, to or is tied to perhaps to your sex, so in terms of like sexual harassment, that is not okay. So that notion of quid pro quo, will you do this for me and I will do this then for you, is still not okay in the workplace. And that same idea, right, is tied to race or to national origin. So, for example, if only one group of people based on their race or based on their color or where they're from or based on their gender is asked to do something and another group is not asked to do something, that's a good reason for potentially asking why. Why is that happening? What is the purpose for that? Because there may then be perhaps some form, if you will, of harassment or discrimination occurring. So workplaces are very much places where I would say harassment and discrimination can also creep in ways that are not obvious because of that power differential and because the supervisor does have the right to ask the employees to perform certain tasks. Sometimes it's blatant and sometimes it's not, frankly, the harassment or discrimination I would say in my experience has been, it's much less obvious. Sexual harassment is obvious. That tends to be the one that people are, there's usually no quibbling about. But oftentimes racial discrimination, gender discrimination, or discrimination based on national origin, sometimes those can be less obvious in the workplace, but still be very much there. So if you ever have any kinds of concerns related to how you are being treated, this is where you do just want to trust your gut a little bit, right? And go to HR and ask them, talk to them about the things that you're experiencing and perhaps why, and to seek their assistance. The other thing I want to tell you about harassment and discrimination in the workplace is that you all, by the time you leave this university, you all know or have been exposed to what is the right and good way to treat another human being, and to have expectations of being treated fairly, and being able to exist and to either do your studies or to work in an environment that is free from that harassment and discrimination. You should be able to enjoy all aspects of the environment, of your work environment, without having to be concerned about the fact that somebody is discriminating against you because of some immutable characteristic. So I think making sure that you know that and remember that when you walk into the workplace, I think is very, very important. The other thing that is the reason that that's so important, or the reason I'm bringing that up probably for the second time in just the few minutes that I've been speaking to you, is because the workplace, not unlike a university, but the workplace in particular, will also be comprised of individuals who most likely are not like you, right? So they don't hold your same race. They may not hold you, in some instances, they may not hold your same gender or gender identity. They may not be from the same part of the world or part of the country that you're from. They may not have the same socioeconomic background that you do. They may not have the same level of education that you do. And so learning how to interact with individuals who are different from you on a grand scale is going to be both interesting and in some ways challenging. People will have very different political views than you do, or they might. They might also come from very, very different generations. And I will tell you, there's in terms of attitudes and understanding of current socioeconomic issues, the generational difference does creep in. And so learning how to negotiate that space with someone who is so different than you are in one way, shape, or form will serve you in good stead, right? Knowing how to be a good citizen within your own company will serve you well. And each company has its own culture, so you're going to definitely want to learn the culture of that company as well. Okay, I've been talking for a very long period of time. I would very much welcome any kind of comment or question that any of you might have, so that I can be helpful. If you know where you're going or what kind of an industry you're interested in working in as well, I can also potentially offer some tips there too. Okay, so I'm just looking a little bit at the chat.
Sherry,
Yes.
we have a question.
Yes.
Maybe you can speak to Title VII, like what kind of protections are built in when you do make a report of discrimination or harassment for against retaliation.
Okay. So if I'm understanding the question right, so for example, I'm just going to use me as an example, right? Because it's kind of easy. If I were to make a report of harassment or discrimination to my employer and I was concerned about retaliation, is that what the question is referring to?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. So employers are, retaliation in the employment space is extremely important to the employer. So in other words, not to retaliate, I should say. Retaliation, the reason employers are so keen to address retaliation when it occurs is because retaliation in and of itself potentially impedes the ability of the employer to prevent harassment and discrimination within the company itself. So retaliation, especially in an employment context, okay, retaliation is an adverse act, okay, that negatively impacts your status as an employee within that institution. It is not an act where someone is mean to somebody else, okay? But so for example, if I made a report of harassment and discrimination, an act of retaliation against me might include the following. I don't receive a pay increase. I'm fired from my job. I don't receive the promotion that I was going for. I am excluded from meetings that I need to attend in order for me to do my job. I am left off of emails that I need to be a part of in order for me to carry out my job. I potentially am applying for another job and someone makes known that I'm a little bit of a troublemaker. And as a result, I am prevented from getting that job. Those are all forms or acts of retaliation. In order for the act of retaliation also must be tied to the fact that I made a report. Okay, so let's say I'm feeling, discriminated against, all right? For whatever reason, my sex, I'm as a woman, I'm being discriminated against. And I raise that to HR, okay, I make that report and I let my supervisor know, I'm like, you treat me horribly because of my sex. I'm always the one that has to do every single menial task in this office. You never ask the guys to do this. I'm the only one you ever asked to do this. I'm being discriminated against. And I need you to stop that, and I'm going to let HR know. Okay. So my supervisor is what we refer to as on notice, right? The supervisor knows that I have expressed that I'm being discriminated against based on my sex, and knows that I'm going to HR. So if that supervisor then, all right, all of a sudden does any of the things that I mentioned, or otherwise takes actions or steps to impede my ability to do my job, okay, or to receive a promotion, or to receive some sort of salary increase, or they cut my salary, right? Or they leave me out of meetings, leave me off of emails, whatever it might be, I can't do my work. And then all of a sudden, what happens when you can't do your work? you get a negative performance evaluation, right? You get the negative performance evaluation. You don't get what? You don't get that merit increase, okay? So those sorts of things would be tied and potentially retaliatory if HR can tie it to the fact that I made a report of discrimination based on my sex. So that's retaliation. Okay, retaliation is not, I tell my supervisor, look, I'm being discriminated against because of my gender. I'm going to go make a report to HR. I make a report to HR, and then all of a sudden, my supervisor doesn't want to have lunch with me anymore, or doesn't pick up my favorite Starbucks drink, or is keeping away from me, doesn't want to be seen around me anymore. Okay, that's not an act of retaliation unless it is through those lunch meetings that I find out vital information that I need in order to be able to what? Do my job. So that's the issue of retaliation. Fear of retaliation is huge for anyone who's ever brought forward a complaint, be it a Title IX complaint or these kinds of complaints with employers. I don't know anyone that is that isn't a living, breathing human being that isn't afraid to bring forward a report. Even people who feel enormously justified that they're going to file that report and feel as though they've been done wrong. Even those individuals are afraid, right? We're always afraid of what might happen because we say that we're not being treated well. I mean, the same happens to me, right? I mean, I have a lot of gray hair here, right? So I've worked for a number of employers. I know what it's like to have to raise a complaint and to be afraid that, wow, I've really just screwed it up now for myself. I've really stirred the waters. And my ability to get that promotion is probably not going to happen because I raised that complaint. So I personally understand the reluctance of individuals to make complaints out of fear, right? What I will tell you from my own experience is that if we don't allow the employer to correct, then we allow the conduct to continue. And that, I think, is a big difference from how sometimes universities operate. And so I think that it's important to bring forward complaints, even though it can be scary, right? I think it's still important. Otherwise, there's the behavior will continue. I will tell you, when things go unaddressed, the behavior continues. When things go unaddressed, people feel emboldened, or sometimes they think, see, it's not a problem. It's okay. It's okay to tell her that. It's okay to treat her that way. It's okay to treat him that way, right? So
Thank you. That answers my question.
Okay, sorry if I went on too long.
It's okay. We have another question from
Yes.
Sarah. What if the HR office at a workplace is not approachable or responsive?
Excellent question, Sarah. So there are departments, depending on where you're going to work. Okay, so and what I mean by that is what state you're going to work in. There is what's referred to as the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or DFEH, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Both of those are federal agencies. They also have state locations in Oregon. Oftentimes it's referred to as BOLI, or the Bureau of Labor and Industry. And that is the equivalent to EEOC and DFEH. You can file a complaint or report with them. Those complaints and reports then are referred to that employer. So for example, If your employer is unresponsive to your complaint, you can file then with the EEOC or the DFEH. They will contact you, review your complaint, and then they have a process for investigating your complaint with your employer. So you do have options outside of your employer's HR office. They will often ask you if you have, right, exhausted your opportunities at your employer. So in other words, just because the HR office is unresponsive, in other words, you're afraid to go there. If you go to the EEOC and say you're just afraid to go to the HR office, you're going to have to let them know not just why, but the potential impact to you if you do first exhaust your opportunities with HR. Does that answer the question? Good.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? I think my biggest advice to you is you don't have to put up with this stuff, right? You deserve to be treated fairly. So don't put up with harassment and discrimination.
Another question from Hannah. If the harassment happened a while ago, is it still a possibility to bring up a Title IX report? In other words, is there a timeline we should follow?
So if it's Title IX, and if it's Title IX, there is no timeline associated with Title IX. So yes, if you have a Title IX issue and you are at a university, you can bring up that report to the Title IX office, Title IX coordinator at any time. There's no time limit.
Sherry, what if that is Title VII? Is that the same, or is there a timeline?
So with Title VII, no, you can still bring your report forward. I would just encourage you to do it as sooner rather than later. The timeline isn't so much the issue relative to Title VII, it's what they can actually do about it that becomes the issue. You know, for example, with a Title IX complaint, you know, oftentimes, especially when it comes to students and graduate students, if you will, a lot of times graduate students will file a Title IX complaint only after they've left the institution. And that's okay. We understand all the reasons why that might occur. If the complaint is filed against someone who is still at the university, then we can still, you know, do something about it. In an employment context, that does also still carry over from that Title VII perspective. But there's a little less eagerness, if you will, if you were to have left your job and then filed your complaint. You're much better off filing your complaint while you are an employee at that workplace.
Thank you.
The only other thing I would say also that is probably worth mentioning is that the definitions of harassment and discrimination that get used in the employment context are different depending on the company that you're going to or that you might be working at. So universities, for example, tend to have much broader definitions of harassment, discrimination, and retaliation than most companies do. Most companies have more narrow definitions of harassment and discrimination. So just just pay attention to that. So when you're getting your job and you're going through, whatever orientation you end up going through at the company, you will be provided all sorts of policies and procedures and rules of the road, if you will, for the company. Read those. Don't just set them aside. Read them. And in them, they will usually have the kinds of definitions regarding harassment and discrimination. And it's always good to know how that company defines harassment and discrimination. So, and in most cases, unless you're working for a university, in most cases, those definitions will be a little bit more narrow than you would expect to find at a university. So just keep that in mind also.
Another question, Sherry. What if workplace harassment doesn't actually occur at your workplace? Maybe you can speak more about that.
Okay, so if the harassment occurs not at the workplace, but occurs between two individuals who have like a reporting relationship, or between individuals where it impacts the work that's being done at the workplace, that matters. That matters. If someone is, for example, right, let's say someone is interacting, two employees are interacting outside of company time, okay, on their own, personal devices. So it's not company owned device, but their own personal devices. And they're just interacting as two adults would in a community, and something goes wrong in that interaction. And it has bearing, right, or weight on one of the employees' ability to do their job back in the workplace, then that does matter, even though they were just two private citizens, if you will, outside of work. Certainly, if they were using any employment devices, such as a phone or a laptop or some sort of, iPad or something like that, then they're using employee equipment or employee software, perhaps, to engage in some sort of harassment or discrimination, then yes, that also matters. Your employer will want to know anything basically that's impacting your ability to do your work. Certainly, if there's a power differential between the two, position or status, right? Power differential, so such as a supervisor or a manager to someone that they supervise or that they manage, or some other employee, then yes, absolutely, that stuff does matter. But much also gets under the, sits under the umbrella also of free speech, right? And free opinion, right? So someone who, can have a Facebook post or some other kind of posting expressing their opinion, perhaps of gay marriage, right? Just to pick a topic, because why not? And someone else may find, that offensive if the posting was something in their private life, was not done under the guise of their position or their affiliation with the company, and it wasn't targeted against anyone in the company, then that's pretty much their right in terms of free speech. And the company will be reluctant to address any of those issues related to something like that. So it has to have some kind of impact back, on the employment setting, or be targeted at that employee in particular, or be related to that person's ability to do their job, such as if a supervisor is harassing or discriminating against somebody off company grounds or outside of the company.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Well, you can always find me. So if you have a Title IX question, you ask me a Title IX question. If you have a question related to just broader categories of harassment and discrimination, whether they're at the university or outside the university, I'm always happy to engage you in some, conversation.